Who is Catherine Opie? Well, she's a girl from the Midwest, from Sandusky, Ohio. Kind of proud of that identity. An artist from the time that it seemed like I wanted to pick up a camera from 9 on. And I am somebody who really loves to figure out the world that we're living in, whether it be politically or personal, through making images and trying to make sense of the world that we live in. I was born in 1961, and why photography is not only the television being on in the living room in the house, what the idea of the nightly news begins to do and how it informs a young mind, but also it was living with both Life, Look, National Geographic magazine, all of these magazines that really dealt with the documentary aspect of what photography kind of showed us in the world. And between that and just really thinking about images and being attracted to them, it was really because I wrote a book report looking at a photograph of child laborers and from my social studies book, and asking my parents for a camera when I was 9 for my 9th birthday. And so it is image culture that I was being born into. And I think it made sense that I was trying to make sense of the world through these things that were always around me within the home. Yeah, the title is a very esoteric title, and I will admit that it is an esoteric title. And I was thinking about how Documenta and the history of Documenta in itself, specifically because it's in Kassel at the museum. And I was thinking and looking at all the titles of all the exhibitions over the years. And I was thinking, like, well, how can a title be a metaphor that engages the work that's inside the museum? And so the title, in relationship to a pause and erasure, which are the two really important words within that, is about us as a species to understand that the politics that we're involved in and the kind of perils that are facing us as a species and our planet are actually about a force of erasure as well. And so how to pick something with a geopolitical title in the time that we're living in under a Trump administration, that was the guiding point of getting to the title about the pause in relationship to erasure. I think that one of the things that you'll see within this exhibition is that I'm really using not only the genre and the voices that are important in terms of guiding me through art history, but also through specifically the medium of photography and that history. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is to understand the medium in a way that as an artist you have an enormous amount of choices in the way that you convey the material or the ideas that you're trying to convey through various bodies of work. And so you'll see these formal relationships to a history of painting within portraiture to then what the camera does in terms of bearing witness. I believe the camera, and when I make images, whether I'm working through different moments within both photo history or art history specifically, there are these ways to be able to think about the work in a more metaphorical way. And so I use that toolbox, as big of a toolbox as it can be, to begin to convey meaning through the various bodies of work. So when all of a sudden you're looking at an abstract landscape where the focus has been racked out, like, why would Kathy start doing that, as a gesture? There's so many meanings behind each gesture within the bodies of work. But it is like very easy in a certain way to disseminate that. You don't have to have a PhD. You know, there was a popularization of abstract photography. What was abstract photography really trying to accomplish? And simply like racking the focus of iconic places within America's national parks, does that abstraction to the meaning have something that relates to us in terms of seeing? What is desire in terms of photography? How do we think about both the building of history and that also history, it fails us as well? All of that is so interesting in image making that I could spend basically the rest of my life geeking out on these thoughts. But there are always these questions that I apply within different various bodies of work to really work on the engagement to the audience and the meaning behind those gestures. I think that one of the things that we need to think about with photography, and you're right, since the invention of photography, it has been used for documentary and bearing witness. I decided to flip this script, and I used to call myself a social documentary photographer. And then when I started photographing high school football players, I realized that I was bearing witness. And I flipped the script at that point because I think that it has always been really confusing to me. What is it to be an artist that is working within the medium of photography and choosing to be a documentarian within that medium, but at the same time you're not a journalist? So how do you make work be these almost long ways of thinking about the world that we're inhabiting? How are we able to understand a history within the medium that was about bearing witness and documentation, but at the same time there can be a certain conceptual approach to the idea of the way that portraits are being made? Yes, those were all my friends in the 90s sitting there, but choosing the bright colored backgrounds flipped the script on what photography was doing in ideas around documentary. They became highly more stylized. Most people called them paintings. You know, there was a really interesting way that if I had photographed my friends, which at that time in the 80s and 90s, in their bedrooms or living rooms or other things that were expected of photography at that time, then it wouldn't have changed. It would have changed the way that we would have looked at the photograph. The architecture wouldn't have been on the body. So with each thing, it is those set of questions you begin to ask yourself as an artist in terms of what is the visual representation that I want to bring forth to the audience. And these decisions, again, are made through a vast array of research, thinking, reading, looking, all of it in order to figure out what I think as an artist is going to best serve what I'm thinking about in terms of a body of work. And I think it is often a very interesting conversation I had when I was teaching with my students about the presence of the camera and the relationship of what it is to document and what it is to also make one's own truth. And all of this can happen with photography. So why is it important for me personally to be there and bearing witness is because unless I watch everything live and I'm really thinking very intensely about what's happening in front of the lens, but also what's on the other side of the lens. So in 2020, which some of the work of 2020 is in the exhibition in Kassel, that body of work was me getting in an RV during the pandemic, during Black Lives Matter, and going around the country to photograph the monuments that remain and the monuments that are removed. Why? Why would I want to do that? Well, one of the things that you never saw within that is you would see the post of the Robert E. Lee Monument from Richmond, Virginia, and the activist site that it began. But what you didn't see is everything around that monument. How does a city begin to deal with protests? What happens when buildings get boarded up, and then what is the signage on those buildings? Behind all actions are also an infrastructure. And unless we understand the infrastructure in all of these ways, by literally being there and bearing witness versus just constantly watching the 24-hour news cycle, we miss all this other opportunity for analysis of the situation. I think the selection of the work for the exhibition is such an important question, because when this came up for this opportunity to have this exhibition, it was right at the time of an election again. And so the works that I have been making for the last, starting, at Trump 1.0, with going from the modernist to rhetorical landscapes to 2020, is actually so much in relationship to German photography and the history of Documenta and Bauhaus. So when you see the collages on the monitors with the stop motion political animations, they're literally thinking about, Germany post World War II. When we think about modernism and who built the modernist houses of LA, that is also affected by post World War II, and who came over from Germany in exile in the US to create this new modernist structure. So a lot of the work within the exhibition is literally in conversation with Germany, in terms of what they went through post-World War II after an authoritative government like Hitler, and that's what we're experiencing in America right now. So the work is chosen so that the viewer would have that moment of that meditation that I talk about in work, that they have that pause standing before a horizon line or an abstract landscape, and then they're reactivated. In the same way we know how to turn on or off the news when we've had too much. So much of this exhibition is because of the times that we're living in America and what Germany experienced. And I wanted to have that conversation. I am a product of going to art school. I graduated from San Francisco Art Institute in 1985 with my bachelor's degree, and Cal Arts in 1988 with my master's degree. When you're formally taught in art, you have to get to a thesis, you have to make bodies of work. You're constantly thinking in not just what the single image does, but what all the images begin to do with one another. How does it enhance a conversation? How does it work with the kind of conceptualization of a project or a body of work? Also in the exhibition is the sunrises and sunsets, a handful of them, where I went from the port of Busan to the port of Long Beach on a container ship and I decided I was going to photograph every sunrise and sunset because of the idea of the cliche that's inherent within that. What happens within that 10-day period of time when the sun doesn't rise and it's fog? That's the beautiful thing about it. That's the timing of photography in itself, that it is a click of a shutter. You are bearing witness. You are looking at something that could be over a 3-year period of time or a 10-day trip on a ship. And then out of those, then you have to go in and edit the bodies of work and the information that you actually want to convey to the audience. And I would say that you get better at it with age, or I would hope so. At least I'm feeling that at 64, that I'm in a zone now of having made work and exhibitions for over 30 years. And so the ability for me to understand the language that I'm trying to put within each body of work is definitely predetermined. But then what's wonderful about photography is all the surprises of actually doing the journey and figuring out what happened on that trip. because there's things that happen that you don't expect. And then how does that inform your preconceived ideas within the work? And so it's a dance that we take between making and then editing. And that is often the world of photography is why did you choose that image? What does that image end up doing to you and the entire body of work? So different bodies of work dictate different time, and then sometimes you have to sit there and put a body of work away for about 6 months after you made it before you even look at the contact sheets, because you need to have that initial experience of the road trip, such as in Norway, 20 days in Norway on a road trip. You need that not to fill your head, and actually the work that you were trying to make and make sense of fill your head. And so there is a thing where in the acting of making the photograph, it's not a good time to be editing your work, in my opinion. The edit happens afterwards, and it's sometimes months and sometimes years. I think that being in Germany for this exhibition, and not to talk about August Saunders, is really a huge missed opportunity. Of course, Saunders influenced my ideas around making portraits in the same way that Louis Hines did. But what Saunders did was really interesting. And what I love about Saunders is how it informed a history of German photography and American photography after Saunders in a certain way. Because what is documentary to typology? Like, I think that's a really great thing to try to break up, because we also have typology that then took off here in terms of ideas of documenting the American West to a certain extent. Louis Baltz, Robert Adams, under New Topographics, was taking Saunders' typologies and rethinking that use of photography in a way to still continually talk about the way that society is constructing itself, and the image then is a further construct of society. And so I think that with me, I didn't want to make typologies, because typology ends up also being somewhat of a pseudoscientific notion. And I think within queer community, typology is definitely there, and it's important to talk about, because that's how we all identified ourselves to one another when we had to be closeted. But at the same time, a typology around that relies too much on a history of the way that science and photography were used and misaligned in ways around identity. And so I'm careful with an idea of a typology, that a typology for me is often use of landscape versus people. I believe that every person has an identity that is singular outside of a group. And so what Saunders did was so important, because you were also looking at genocide. And so the relationship to, what was happening in really ideas of the government and Hitler and so forth in Germany at that time when Saunders started this body of work was so important, in the same way that the idea of erasure is important within the title of this exhibition. Because if Saunders hadn't done those typologies, then what kind of erasure would we have had of German society? And so these get really, really complicated, but at the same time, I'm very careful within queer identity that typology could be a tricky misnomer, so to speak. The Düsseldorf Academy, although it was started by the Beckers, and their work was utterly important to me, but in the same way that I spoke of why typology is, fraught with me, so to speak. Without the Düsseldorf Academy, without Yale, without these different institutions that were literally really talking about this field, from all of these different levels, it just enhanced the ability for us to have a conversation around this medium, to tell you the truth. And the Dusseldorf Academy for German Photography was, you know, it's a symbiotic relationship in my mind. That you have Struth, Roof, Gertzke, Dieter Hofer, you know, I mean, Alger Essen is a really interesting person out of the Dusseldorf Academy, because in certain ways, the way that he printed and the way that he chose was very different than what was coming out of the Academy. So the other thing is that you can lump this certain group of people in out of the Academy, but you're talking about a long-running Academy with an enormous amount of important people teaching in it that have influenced photography throughout the world. And that is particularly one of the reasons why I'm so excited to finally have this first exhibition in Germany, is I've always been having these conversations with Germany.